today we're going to talk a little bit about the science of fat shaming. I've dedicated basically over the last decade of my research career investigating what happens when people are fat shamed, what happens to them, and trying to create a scientific basis for why we shouldn't be mean to people because of the way they look. Throughout, you can ask questions. I'll try and monitor the chat. Feel free to unmute and ask a question or raise your hand. But I did leave a full 20 minutes or so at the end for questions. So you can ask them throughout or hold them to the end. So I wanted to give you a little bit of context. Probably if you're here, you already know that fat shaming is widespread, but I wanted to give you some examples. So this is from several years ago now. A blog called Return of Kings declared the certain week in October to be fat shaming week, and they invited fat shaming tweets. And there are several that were submitted, like this one. One of the downsides of obesity is that you run the risk of being harpooned for whale oil when S hits the fan. Now, I don't even know what that means, but I do know that it's incredibly mean and intended to hurt people with heavier bodies. And so you can see that this kind of thing is widespread, but it's not just in random corners of the internet. It's throughout society. So even in the context of academia. So here is Jeff Miller. He's a professor of psychology at the University of New Mexico, who said, "Dear obese PhD applicants, if you didn't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation, #truth." So even at the highest echelons of places where we would hope people would be protected from denigration and prejudice, you still see it. And even in the medical community. So the issue of what does weight stigma and fat shaming, I'll be using those terms interchangeably today, what is the effect of it? And so there are actual medical ethicists like Daniel Callahan in this slide who say, we should be using weight stigma to motivate people and to make them really understand that it's not okay to be obese. And so he advocates for the public health usage of weight stigma in order to curb what he calls this obesity epidemic. And even in children, so Callahan also wrote a piece saying we should be using stigma to make children understand it's not okay to be obese. And so I was at first on the sidelines of this debate, like, it seems to be poor public health policy to, use a tool that makes people feel bad about themselves. But, at the core, I am a scientist. And so really what I wanted to do was answer the question with data. Will shaming people because of their size truly help people lose weight? And my initial hypothesis was no. And that was because I come from a field of psychology called health psychology. And you can take a health psychology class here at Psych 150, to learn more about it. But one thing I knew from my health psychology training is that of all the different stressors out there in the world, it's those that are A, social, and B, evaluative or involve judgment that elicit the most cortisol. And so cortisol is a stress hormone. And one of the jobs of cortisol in your body is to make you deposit fat, especially in the belly region. And another thing cortisol does is it makes the food that you eat taste really good, especially when it's high sugar and high fat. So it actually has effects on the brain to make you be super responsive to these foods. And so this graph, you don't need to know the specifics of it, but it just shows that this biggest cortisol response, so cortisol is what's on the y-axis, is in these stressors that involve social situations and judgment or evaluative situations. And so I was thinking about this and I was thinking, okay, so cortisol makes people gain weight, and it's social and evaluative stressors that make you secrete the most cortisol. Well, weight stigma and fat shaming is definitely social. And it's definitely evaluative. It definitely involves judgment of people. And so I started to put all these thoughts kind of together in my brain and realizing, oh my gosh, we're in this vicious cycle situation where people can experience weight stigma, and that causes stress, and that could cause people to eat more, and also it'll cause their cortisol to go up, and that could make them gain weight, which will make them even more at risk of further fat shaming and weight stigma. And so I started to kind of think about and put together this theoretical cyclic model, which I called the cyclic obesity weight-based stigma model, or the cobwebs model, to really make the point that people get stuck in the cobwebs. They get stuck in this cycle and they can't get out. And so what I'm going to do today for the next 35 minutes or so is kind of show you how my science kind of unfolded from the very, very beginning to where it is now. And I'll show you some hot off the presses new data that I just analyzed for this. So first, the first thing I wanted to see is there any evidence whatsoever that weight stigma could lead to cortisol and that stress is involved somehow? And so this was just the very, very first proof of concept studies looking at, is there any correlation between weight stigma and cortisol? And so this is a study that I did with my collaborators at UCSF, Jennifer Dobbenmeyer and Alyssa Epple. And so the hypothesis was that, yes, weight stigma will be correlated with cortisol levels. So it was this very first kind of tiny study of 45 women where we measured weight stigma. And so we measured weight stigma in a couple of different ways. One is we asked about objective things that happen to people because of their size. So losing a job because of your size. But we also wanted to capture the more psychological aspects of weight stigma. So I worry that my behaviors will be viewed as stereotypical of people who are overweight. So kind of capturing both these things that happen to you and your kind of thoughts and consciousness of weight stigma. And what we found is, yes, indeed, there is a correlation. So let me just orient you to this graph for those of you who are maybe a little rusty on looking at graphs. On the x-axis here is weight stigma. So the more you go to the right, the higher your weight stigma is that you experience. Here on the y-axis is cortisol. So the more cortisol you have, the higher up on the graph. So what you can see is, just combining the green and red lines, the more weight stigma people experience, the higher their cortisol, right? So this is kind of showing that proof of concept step that people who have more weights, who experience more weight stigma and are aware of more weight stigma, have higher cortisol levels. The second thing that I found so interesting about this study is that it doesn't really matter what you actually weigh or what your actual body mass index is. You still see a relationship between the amount of weight stigma someone experiences and their cortisol levels. So the red line and the red dots are the skinniest people in our study. And the green line and the green dots are the heaviest people in our study. And it kind of doesn't matter whether you are on the thinner end or the heavier end, you still see the same exact relationship between weight stigma and cortisol. And to me, this is really interesting and it's really important. It means that even people who are objectively thin in terms of their body mass index, if they're experiencing weight stigma, they have higher cortisol. So it's something we need to worry about for everyone throughout society. So that was the first study, just finding that stigma is correlated with cortisol. Of course, correlation is not causation. Hopefully you're all saying. So the only way to really say that something causes something is you have to do a randomized controlled experiment. And so that's what we did in study 2 with Mary Himmelstein and Angela Rodriguez, my two students. And what we did, I'll walk you through this as if you're a participant in the study, but let me tell you the hypothesis is that experiencing weight stigma is going to cause increases in cortisol levels. So this was a study in 110 UCLA students, women, and we recruited women who perceived themselves as heavy and perceived themselves as thin. And the reason why we did that is because in the last study that I just showed you, it isn't really about your objective body size. It's about sort of your psychological experience of your body size. And we randomly assign them to either experience weight stigma or not. Okay, so this was one of the most difficult and challenging studies that we have ever run in our lab. So we advertised the study as the psychology of shopping. And we told people you're going to be shopping in groups to understand hormonal responses to shopping. And so you walked into the lab, and there was a room where the door was kind of halfway open, and there were a bunch of clothing just like this. And pop music was blaring from this room. So it really seemed like there was some sort of fun shopping thing going on. And we said, an up and coming UCLA alumna designer donated the clothes for today's shopping activity. But first, we need to see if you're going to fit into the clothing. And so we took them to another room and we weighed them. And we then had the participant come into a waiting room with a very thin confederate. So a confederate is just a fancy word for someone who's actually working with a study, but the participant doesn't know that. They think they're just another participant. And so we accepted the thin confederate into the study. And then we turned to the actual participant and delivered this line. Unfortunately, your shape and size just aren't ideal for this style of clothing. We really do want everyone to have fun and feel good. Plus, we want to return the clothing to the designer in good condition. So this is how we had participants experience weight stigma. Now, at this point, if this were a live presentation, half of the room is gasping and shocked that we would do this kind of have participants go through this kind of an experience. And the other half of the room is like, yeah, welcome to my everyday. And so it's really interesting the different kinds of response we see to this. I will say it was fully IRB approved. We did a full debrief with everybody. There were no adverse events reported. In fact, one of the participants said, this is really interesting. Can I join your lab as a research assistant? And she's now in grad school for psychology. Yes, definitely everyday experiences for so many of us, Jennifer and Iris. I don't know what podcast it is, but I'm glad this is ringing a bell. Okay, so what we found, I should say that we also excluded the control condition. So it's not just, the fact that you got rejected from an activity that might make your cortisol go up. It's something specific about weight stigma in particular. And so what we found is only in participants who perceive themselves as heavy. So notice that if you think of yourself as thin, then kind of just slides off your back like water off a duck's back. But if you think of yourself as heavy, and I'll note several people in this heavy perceived weight group did not have objectively overweight or obese body mass indices. So people who perceive themselves as being heavier, they showed in the cortisol condition, in the stigma condition, higher cortisol levels than people in the control condition. So stigmatized participants had higher cortisol than control participants. So now I can definitively say that yes, weight stigma causes cortisol secretion. So it's something that we need to be worried about. It's not just something that makes people feel bad, which in itself is not okay, but in addition, it's harming their actual physiology. And so that's something that, doubly is something we need to be worried about. Okay, so the next study that I'm going to talk to you about is now looking at this number 2 pathway, the eating pathway, because the previous study only talked about cortisol. And this is a study done by Courtney and Angela, again, my former students. And in this study, we hypothesized that putting on weight stigma, you'll see why that's in quotes, will cause increases in eating. So this is a sample of 109 undergraduate students, just like many of you here. This is the first study I'm showing you where we're also including men. And what the punchline is, doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, everybody is vulnerable to weight stigma and fat shaming. We randomized the participants to either put on a fat suit or put on the same clothing, just not with a fat suit. With the, actually, I can show you a picture. So here's Gloria, one of our research assistants, in the fat suit, and here she is wearing the same clothing but without the fat suit underneath. Um, my husband is in the entertainment industry, so I had him ask some costume designers that he knew, like, what is the most realistic looking fat suit? And the costume, and I was ready to pay whatever money it took to get a realistic looking one. And they said, actually, the best one is this $12.99 one off of Amazon. So who knew? Um, and so we had this very elaborate cover story for why we needed people to do this, which I can go into later if you're interested. But basically, we had people either put on the fat suit or not. And we had them walk from Franz Hall, where the psychology department is, to Kirchhoff Hall. So when I'm giving this talk at other universities, I have to explain, okay, so Kirchhoff, there's always lots of people around, but those of you who are here fully understand what Kirchhoff is and the amount of people that you would encounter walking from Franz Hall to Kirchhoff Hall. So the point of this was to expose individuals to the eyes of others, and potentially experience what it feels like to experience weight stigma. And we measured a number of different things. So we measured hurt feelings, negative emotions, but we also looked at anti-fat attitudes here. So what we were hoping is that this would serve as kind of an empathy intervention where people can walk a mile literally in the shoes of someone with a heavier body, and hopefully increase some empathy and decrease anti-fat attitudes. And then, of course, we're really interested in eating behavior. So we gave participants M&Ms, potato chips, and full sugar Coca-Cola. How did the control condition work? So we had them put on the same clothes, and we also had them walk. So we had them do everything the same. It's just the size of their body was either whatever their normal size was or with this fat suit on. Good question, Fatima. So the things in red are the things that were higher in the fat suit group. So they felt more anger, they felt more depression, they felt more anxiety, and they felt more rejection. So interesting that their anti-fat attitudes did not change. If anything, they actually went up a little bit. So walking a mile in their shoes actually increased anti-fat attitudes. I'm still trying to figure this out. So if you have any ideas, I would love to hear them. But this is actually a very common thing with weight stigma and fat shaming kind of interventions. We still don't have a silver bullet that works to decrease people's anti-fat attitudes. They're very hard to change. And so we had hoped this empathy intervention might work, but it didn't. Relevant to today's talk, they did eat more M&Ms, ate more potato chips, and drank more Coca-Cola. And so that to us speaks to weight stigma also causing unhealthy eating, not just increased cortisol. And so, these are all sort of one-time things in the laboratory. Like, who knows if it really actually has any effect on weight gain, which takes place over a long period of time, right? So the next study I want to talk to you about is a study I did with Jeff Hunger, who has this incredible last name for this kind of research. So in this case, we looked at data from this really remarkable study called the NHLBI Growth and Health Study, which looked at almost 2,400 girls who were either Black or white. And they measured a whole bunch of things about them at age 10, measured them once a year, every year for 10 measurement points till they hit age 19 from 3 different sites across the United States. And they were asked at age 10, have any of these people told you you're too fat? So this is the measure of weight stigma. And it was followed by a list that had father, mother, sister, brother, best girlfriend, boy you like best because they're 10-year-olds, and teacher. And what we looked at was whether or not at age 19, people who had experienced weight stigma were at greater risk of having an obese body mass index at age 19. And what we found is that, yes, in fact, uh, you were 66% more likely to have an obese body mass index at age 19 if you had experienced weight stigma at age 10. And the important thing about this analysis is that it controls for body mass index. So it's not just that heavier girls end up heavier at the end of at age, it's not that heavier girls at age 10 just end up heavier at age 19. It means no matter what you weigh, if you experience weight stigma, you're at 66% increased risk of having an obese body mass index. The other thing that is really interesting to me about this is that the effect of family members stigmatizing you was bigger than the effect of non-family members stigmatizing you. And so this is something that is very unique to weight stigma, where normally the people around you who are closest to you are the source of support for you if you experience any kind of prejudice or discrimination, right? So if someone was mean to me because I was Asian, I could go to my mom and she would likely support me. However, it kind of flips in the case of weight, where the people who are closest to us, our family members, can often be the harshest source of weight stigma. And so that's what makes it a particularly devastating form of stigma to experience. Okay. I'm going to skip that for time. And it's not just obesity risk, it's also eating disorder risk. So it's this sort of flip side where when you're labeled as too fat, the girls are 61% more likely to engage in these unhealthy weight control behaviors like taking dieting pills, using laxatives, vomiting, or extreme fasting. And so it's a really something that is a concern for health at both ends of the spectrum. All right, so hopefully through these 4 studies, I've kind of given you enough evidence to believe that maybe there's this kind of cyclic model going on. I wanted to share with you, actually, I don't think I optimized for sharing sound. So let me reshare here. Okay. I wanted to tell you about an ongoing study that we're doing. And please tell me in the chat if you can't hear the audio. But this is a study where we're trying to understand, what does weight stigma look like in everyday life? And we wanted to really learn from our participants what experiences they were having. And so I'm going to show you the video we showed participants when we trained them, like, what are you going to be doing in this study? So let me just play this for you.
Welcome to the Omniscience mobile system for patient engagement. This demo will show you how the OmniPro system will collect your responses via text message during the UCLA texting study. Once you start the study, you will text the keyword event to the number 87888 every time you experience weight stigma. That's when you're treated differently because of your weight, or something or someone makes you feel bad because of your weight.
So one thing to notice is we didn't predefine what weight stigma was to our participants. We said, if you think it is, it is. And so please tell us about it.
As soon as you text event, you will receive a message prompting you to give a saliva sample using the clear tube from the materials we've provided. After giving the saliva sample, reply with the letter Y to continue. You will immediately receive a 3-question survey asking about your stress levels, feelings of shame, and the situation that initially prompted you to text event. Lots of events can count as stigmatizing. If it makes you feel bad, you should report it.
So we are looking at these brief descriptions of the events, and that way we can tell, do people have a stronger response when it's a family member, for example, or when it's a member of the media, or if it is a physician in the healthcare setting. So we can do additional analyses to look at like what source is most impactful.
Upon completing the first survey, the final message notifies you that you will receive a follow-up survey in 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, you will receive a prompt to give a second saliva sample using the colored tube. You will then answer 4 more questions about hunger and food intake.
So that's how we're measuring their cortisol levels through the saliva samples. We gave them these cute little kits to carry around with them to collect their saliva, and then also eating, right? So we're trying to test that whole cobwebs model. Jennifer asks, I'm wondering if any of the events reported were fat shaming that came from themselves. This is something that I've seen in a few friends. This is an amazing question. I've never been asked, so usually I have to say it. So Jennifer, great question. There was a substantial percentage of the responses that were self-shaming. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and berated myself. Why did I have that extra muffin, kind of thing. And so we are really interested in that as a sort of additional phenomenon. So people who experience it and internalize it, which is the fancy word for what we're talking about here, probably are at most risk. So how can we target that in future research? Yeah, and we got some plus ones going on there. I think that is, you get the gist of this study.
Well,
Oops. And so I just wanted to share some of the preliminary results. So here are some of the things that participants responded with. I went into the store to try on clothes and the salesperson told me they didn't have anything in my size. So this really made me think that in that psych of shopping study that I described to you in the very beginning, that was a good example of real world weight stigma. So that made us feel really good about the experimental study that we did. Not good, of course, we felt terrible about doing that, but in the interest of science, it was very uh, consistent. Um, I was at the gym playing ball, and one of the other guys said, "I got the fat guy." So this really illustrates that weight stigma is not just a problem in girls or in women; that both genders experience weight stigma. And so it's not something that we don't have to worry about in men. And then maybe the most scary and insidious example, I was at the doctor's office, and of course I was told I needed to lose weight as if I'm not trying. So I think weight stigma and fat shaming from healthcare providers is a real problem, because what happens is it results in healthcare avoidance. So people don't want to go to the physician. And then if something is really wrong with them, the diagnoses are caught later. And so they'll have poorer health outcomes. And so I'm doing quite a bit of work in the healthcare sphere for trying to eradicate weight stigma. You might remember a couple years ago, Rebecca Hiles' story went viral, where multiple physicians told her that her shortness of breath was just due to her obesity and that all she needed to do was lose weight, when in fact what she had was lung cancer. And so her diagnosis was delayed by several years. And so I think healthcare is someplace where we really, really need to attend to this issue. In terms of eating, so compared to when they didn't experience weight stigma, they ate actually exactly one more serving of food after they were stigmatized. So that's consistent with the cobwebs model. And what were they eating? Lots of high calorie, high fat, high sugar, high salt, palatable foods. So potato chips, flaming hot Cheetos, for whatever reason, came up a lot. It's a Southern California sample, so a lot of Mexican food, nachos, burritos, tacos, and then kind of your classic comfort foods, chocolate, ice cream, were the foods that were nominated. And so you could see how this vicious cycle could be occurring. And then currently we're doing a big study that tests the whole model all in one study. So we measure weight stigma at baseline and then stress 3 months later. And then 3 months later, we measure cortisol and eating. And then 3 months later, we measure weight gain. And then 3 months later, we measure to see if it really is cyclic, if this cycle kind of perpetuates itself. And so that is kind of just a brief overview of some of the studies I'm doing, or I have done and am doing. I also wanted to give a pitch for a new mindfulness and body image study that we are just about to launch. We're enrolling now. It is a study that uses mindfulness principles. It's completely online, so you don't have to do anything in person. Um, and it's designed for individuals who might be feeling down about their bodies or having a little bit of body image issues, to kind of help people deal with those kinds of feelings and attitudes. It's a 1 month program, 1 hour per week for 4 weeks, completely online. And we have synchronous and asynchronous versions depending on your schedule. And there's compensation of $100. So if this is something that you might be interested in, or Lola, if it's something that you could help us advertise for, I think it could be really helpful. And so I'll stop there and just say my website, dishlab.org, is where you can get more info on that study. It's where you can find little one bite, um, easy to understand summaries of all of my papers, as well as our blog, and all our social media is up there as well.